Welcome to this 8th AfCFTA Townhall meeting, the 8th in the series that ALP has been doing for some time, ever since the AfCFTA came into our general consciousness. Welcome to everyone who's on and about to join. We will jump very quickly into the order of the day. I will start by a short introduction. We have a sterling panel of speakers this morning, but just some brief remarks about what we're doing here today. So the AfCFTA, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area, it refers to the Unified Africa Single Market created by members of the African Union, very similar to what we have in the European Union, the EU. And when it is fully active, so to speak, it'll be the world's largest free trade area because it encompasses all 55 countries on the continent, and it's already been ratified by 54 countries that have submitted their instruments of ratification. And the AfCFTA has 8 protocols which were recently publicized. The 8th in the list of protocols is the protocol on women youth in trade, which we're discussing today. And ever since we started the AfCFTA, we've had 8 town halls, and coincidentally, although we've tried loosely to model each town hall after each of the protocols, coincidentally, this eighth town hall is in respect of the 8th protocol. The first one we had was understanding the AfCFTA, because we realized that a lot of people hear about it, talk about it. It was a buzzword, but people didn't really understand what it was all about. The second one was, what could the forthcoming investment protocol at the time mean to you and your business? So what we try to do with these seminars, these webinars, is to try and make the AfCFTA live, real to ordinary people, people who will benefit from it, who will use it, who will be affected by it. The third town hall was asking the question, how can the AfCFTA competition protocol ensure development of an optimal competition regime on the continent, which is key, because if there's no viable competition, then naturally some businesses will suffer and others will thrive. So there has to be healthy competition, properly regulated competition, and that's what the AfCFTA competition protocol is trying to achieve. The fourth town hall was on e-commerce, unleashing Africa's digital economy. And this, of course, was of interest to many of the younger people who are doing all sorts of wonderful things in the area of in the digital economy. The fifth town hall was on unlocking cross-border trade with African payment infrastructure. We all know how that has grown in leaps and bounds exponentially, how we can, just by the press of a few buttons from anywhere on the continent, conduct transactions and so on and so forth. And this was of great interest to us at ALP. We had our 5th town hall on that. The 6th town hall was AfCFTA, what it means for trade in Africa, exploring mergers and acquisitions under the competition policy that we had discussed in the 3rd town hall. And I'm sure we'll all agree that mergers and acquisitions will soon become a very key part of the entire AfCFTA protocol. As business and trade thrives on the continent, there will, of course, be mergers and acquisitions. So we wanted to explore that, and we did that in the 6th town hall. The last one before this one was exploring the guided trade initiative, reimagining the global supply chain. How do we trade with other parts of the world? How do we trade within the African continent? As always, the overriding objective was to simplify the AfCFTA and bring it home, make it real to ordinary users to the legal community, to the business community, the trade community. And today, we're talking about the AfCFTA as it affects women and youth in trade. And as I said in my LinkedIn post, no better time to discuss this than in the month in which International Women's Day falls. So with those brief remarks, I would like to introduce my co-moderator, who is joining us today from Ghana. Good morning, Nana. Would you like to say a few words about what we're doing here today? First, about yourself. Please tell everyone who you are and what you do. I didn't remember to introduce myself. My name is Oyinkan Badijo Okuso. I'm a partner at ALP NG and Co. And it's my pleasure and privilege to be co-moderating this session today with Nana. Nana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oyinka, and good morning to everybody. Good afternoon. I realize that it's already afternoon in some places where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining our town hall. My name is Nana Joa Hackman. I am the managing partner of Africa Legal Associates, which is a corporate and commercial law firm based in Accra, Ghana. I'm also the founder of Drive to Inspire Africa, a non-profit organization which is focused on education for youth and mentorship for girls. So I'm really glad to be joining Oyinkan to moderate this panel of brilliant and accomplished women today as we discuss this topic. As you all know, the 8th of March, the world celebrated International Women's Day, as we do every year. But we at Africa Legal Associates and Africa Law Practice decided to celebrate the whole month. So in furtherance of that, we decided to have this town hall today to have a discussion about the AfCFTA protocol on women and youth and how things are going. How does it affect you? What does it mean to you? And I'm very excited about the diversity of locations that our speakers are coming from as well. It would allow us to have a broad perspective and break things down. So yes, I'm excited. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Nana. And so without further ado, I will introduce everyone in no particular order. I have Faith Tigere Pitet. She's a She Trades Policy Advisor to the AfCFTA at the International Trade Center, and I'm sure she will tell us more about what She Trades means. She works with women and policymakers on issues related to AfCFTA. She holds a master's degree in international trade law and economics from the University of Witwatersrand, and her areas of expertise include regional integration issues, trade and gender, and digital trade. So she's a very important person to have on this panel. We're very happy to have her particular expertise. Julia Charlton is the founding and managing partner of Charlton's, an award-winning Hong Kong corporate finance Hong Kong law firm. Julia is admitted as a solicitor in Hong Kong, England, and Wales, and the British Virgin Islands. She practices in the field of corporate finance, including mergers and acquisitions, private equity, securities, virtual assets, and funds. She's also a member of the Commonwealth Enterprise and Investment Council's Global Advisory Council. Thank you, Julia. Dr. Ama Onyerima, Dr. Ama is the Vice Chair and co-founder of Africa Sustainable Trade. She's a dynamic global citizen whose extensive professional journey spans continents. Her remarkable expertise as a recognized sustainability entrepreneur, educationist, behavioral consultant, and resilience coach, thought leader, author, and podcaster is at the heart of her impactful story. And I'm hoping that in the course of this webinar, we will hear more about that. Janice Kimaro is the regional coordinator of the East African Women in Business platform. She's an experienced finance specialist and technical advisor with a demonstrated history of working with international and regional organizations in project management, finance management, procurement, human resource, and performance management. And last but not the least, Isabel Aqua is a director at the Center for Law and Innovation Foundation. She's a dual qualified corporate advisory lawyer with a background in investment banking. She's a multilingual professional. She speaks French, German, Spanish, and English. I am so envious. She has over 20 years of legal and business experience across a number of jurisdictions in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And so that is our sterling panel. You will agree with me. This is actually intimidating. And I hope we all have our seatbelts on so we can listen to everything that we have to say. Thank you very much, ladies, for joining us and taking time out of your schedules to do this. We appreciate your presence here. Perhaps, Nana, why don't you go first and ask the first question while I try to sort out my papers here. Over to you, Nana.
Okay, Oyinka, I mean, I would like to start taking this from looking at the problems that women face and for which reason we are having these discussions and what the protocol seeks to achieve. So I'd like to take it, Julia, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. Julia, the problems encountered by women in trade are similar across jurisdictions in terms of getting a seat at the table for similar market trade opportunities. How effective do you think strict quotas for women-owned businesses would be in practice?
Thank you. Well, I do think quotas are actually important in some areas, although there can be a lot of social resistance to them. But I also think the approach needs to be part of a wider effort to enable women to have more equality of opportunity in relation to trade opportunities. But I do think that quotas, at least on a temporary basis, which focus on equality of outcome as well as equality of opportunity, are very important. And I think there was a recent World Bank report on women, business and law, which finds that the global gender gap for women in the workplace is far bigger than was previously estimated. I mean, that's not just in Africa. And no country provides equal economic opportunity for women, not even wealthy nations. And the World Bank's report includes indicators on safety from violence and childcare access. They're important factors in supporting women's participation in the workplace. And I think some of the gender violence can particularly affect women in Africa. In particular, I've seen some research about crossing trade boundaries where women can be affected by that. I think there's also a big implementation gap. So even where there's laws enacted, only about 40% of the necessary supporting systems and enforcement mechanisms are in place in order to actually enforce this. And it's estimated that if we actually brought significant numbers of African women into the workplace, that would increase Africa's overall GDP by billions. And, women entrepreneurs, which there's a relatively high proportion of women entrepreneurs in Africa, and they face numerous barriers, access to finance, information, business networks everywhere. But I think Africa, no less than anywhere else. And I think that well-designed quotas can help to address gender imbalances and promote equal opportunities. And I would, for example, draw attention to some areas like, obviously, this is a rather high level of engagement, but for women on boards of listed companies, Europe has got legislation mandating this. And I think the highest level is achieved in France, with about 47% of boards, listed company boards, have women. And a couple of other Scandinavian countries have over 40%. So I do think that actually mandating it makes a massive change and a massive effort. And I don't think that we should shy away from the pushback that inevitably results from actually insisting on more quota-driven outcomes, although clearly they don't apply everywhere. And access to education, access to finance may be somewhat quota-driven, but it cannot be completely quota-driven.
Thank you very much for that, Julia. It seems almost a pity that we have to insist on these things, but I like what you said. We shouldn't shy away from them, because for as long as those inequalities exist. And until the field becomes a lot more level, I agree, we shouldn't shy away from them. We should continue to push them and ensure that they adhere to until it becomes the norm. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to direct the next question to Faith. And my first question to you, Faith, is this. The African continent is home to abundant primary goods and raw materials. We know that. I mean, there's so much going for us here in terms of raw materials, in terms of primary goods. So how do you reckon that the ITC's work with women could supplement the effectiveness of this protocol and the utilization of local resources? I'd also like you to spend a minute or so just explaining what She Trades is all about for the benefit of listeners. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and thank you for this opportunity to join this lovely panel with our esteemed colleagues. My name is Faith Tigere-Pite, and I'm the policy advisor to the AfCFTA for the She Trades team. So for those that do not know what the She Trades initiative is, this was a program that we launched to remove barriers to women's participation in trade by mainly working with governments, the private sector, and also entrepreneurs in order to help them build their business capacities, particularly of women, in order to create a more sustainable and a fairer global economy. We provide women entrepreneurs and producers with access to knowledge, resources, networks, and also we support policymakers on inclusive policy reforms and also leverage public and private partnerships to amplify the impact of our work. So that's, in a nutshell, the She Trades initiative. For the support relating to your question, in order to supplement, currently we have been working on this project called Empowering Women to Trade at the AfCFTA, which we launched in 2019. So this project has 3 tiers, and the main purpose is to support women to benefit from the opportunities that have been created under the AfCFTA. And we have been implementing this at the continental level, at the regional level, and at the national level. Mostly at the continental level, we've been working with over 150 women's business associations. And currently we are running a program that is targeted specifically at agricultural products and how women can benefit under the AfCFTA. So what we do is we offer first export readiness trainings. So this is a comprehensive program that women go through and teaches them on how to package, how to present their goods, and also understanding what the AfCFTA is and how they can benefit from the agreement. We also have online training program on agro-processing. So this is a targeted program that looks at the women in the agricultural sector and the agro-processing sector. And we are providing this training in order for them to participate in trade fairs. For example, we have a comprehensive program on how to prepare, exhibit, and organize your trade fair participation, how to develop your export marketing strategy, how to enhance your visibility through social media. And also we talk about the different certifications that are relevant to agro-foods and also the basics of exporting and how to build an export price. So basically, with these tools that we are providing with the women, they can benefit with the protocol now that it has been finalized. We are preparing the women to be ready to start trading. And also we are engaging with the private sector. So we are engaging with supermarkets. We are engaging with also international companies so that the women can export their goods to the different countries in the continent under the AfCFTA. So this is basically what we've been doing to support women under the AfCFTA. Thank you.
Sounds fantastic. Before I hand back over to Nana, First of all, one point about what you mentioned, the online training in agribusiness, that sounds really exciting. And I hope we'll have an opportunity for you to share a link or something where people who are in that line of business can log on and find out more about it. Also, I'd like to tell all our listeners and watchers that there's a poll that has, the first of several polls that we'll be conducting during this webinar has been posted. So please take the poll so that we get your feedback. It helps us to design our webinars in a way that is targeted and benefits the most users. Nana, over to you. Thank you very much.
Before I go to my question, thank you very much, Faith, for that. I mean, capacity building for women and youth is key to all of this. So it's really great that you brought out all the assistance that is out there, all the support that women can access to help them to increase their play in trade. And incidentally, a She Trades Hub was launched yesterday in Accra. Yeah, I'm sure you know that. So I'll come back to you in a bit to talk about She Trades again. But before then, I'd like to ask Janice. Janice, East Africa, Janice is joining us from Tanzania, and East Africa is home to arguably the most integrated regional economic community. What is the general approach to women involved in business, and what measures would you consider to be the most effective solutions for the challenges that they face?
Thank you very much, moderator. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me in this online workshop. So as the moderator has mentioned, EAC is one of the most integrated RECs, but what has worked for the women entrepreneurs in the region? I think I will mention like 4 points. First, the establishment of the one-stop border posts within the EAC region has sort of like facilitated the movement of entrepreneurs, women cross-border traders within the region. Also, there is an establishment of a simplified trade regime whereby women that are trading with a merchandise of over $2,000 or less are exempted from paying import duties. And of course, the process of them clearing their goods across the borders are a bit simpler compared to the people who are trading with the merchandise of over $2,000. So the community has established that, and that has sort of like facilitated like a lot of movement of cross-border trade within the region. We have the issue of access to finance. There has been an initiative, of course, still supported by GIZ, whereby we know most of the women do not have smartphones, are not aware on how to use like internet to access information. So Sauti Africa has established a platform and that uses USSD technology, whereby even a person with a simple phone that does not have internet can access trading information within the EAC region. The trade information, this goes around the exchange rate, the pricing of different commodities from the relevant ministries of trade and agriculture within the EAC partner states. The demand and supply within the countries and so forth. And of course, we've seen the establishment of border markets in some of the partner states, in some of the borders. For instance, in Busia border has sort of like eased the trading within the cross-border women traders. But we have all these initiatives in place and all these measures in place, but still there are a number of challenges that the cross-border women are facing. Of course, we have seen we have the OSBPs all over the regions like Busia, Malaba, Namanga, and so forth. But then what are the facilities that are favoring women within the cross-borders? We can see that there is a lack of breastfeeding facilities, clean toilets within the borders. that's one of the some of the challenges that are faced by the women. I know there are some OSBPs that have that in place, but still there is still more needs to be done in these borders. We also have an issue of lack of storage facilities, whereby when people are trading with perishables, if the clearing of goods within the borders takes a longer time, they end up losing the quality of their goods, or even like losing them completely. So that is still a gap that we have. And yeah, we are calling up to other development partners to sort of like, and the governments, of course, to support the establishment of these facilities. The issue of access to information is still there. I know there is an initiative from Saudi, establishment of the USSD technology to access trade information. But then how many people are aware of this platform? Very few. Faith has mentioned ITC has a very broad causes for women entrepreneurs, a lot of information, very rich information that is developed under the She Trade Initiative. But how many women out here are aware of it? There is a lot of sensitization and awareness creation that we need to do within the region to sort of like facilitate the movement of cross-border trade. And then that now the AfCFTA, there's a bigger market that has opened in Africa. What are we doing as stakeholders to sort of like facilitate the movement of these cross-border women within our REX and Africa at large? So I think there is a lot of awareness creation and sensitization that needs to be done. Also, of course, this goes hand in hand with the issue of like sharing information within our relevant platforms and within our members and government ministries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You raise a very good point about awareness. And it's amazing how it's the very simple things that stand in the way of women really, exploring and exploiting all the opportunities that abound. And so I think there's a charge to all the women sitting around this panel. The awareness and all the wonderful things that are being done will come to nothing really if the people who will benefit from them are not aware of them. So the charge, I guess, is for us all in our various endeavors to ensure that the awareness is created and well created too, in a way that the end users can appreciate and understand the opportunities that are available to them to explore and exploit, so that all these trades and businesses can really fly. So I think that's one charge, one takeaway from here. I come to you, Dr. Ama, and I'd like to ask this question. When we hear the term women in trade within an African context, it's easy for people to think about the literate businesswoman who's engaged in business for the livelihood of her family. And I think that image has kind of been connoted even in the last offering that we just listened to. Notwithstanding this common perception, though, how do you engage women to such an extent that they see their business opportunities beyond a mere means to an end, but as value-creating entities that can contribute meaningfully to the economy? I think this question ties in very nicely with the last one that the last discussion we just heard. So if you just take up from there and give us your views on this area. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kemisola, for that question. And may I begin by just acknowledging African Law Practice for convening this town hall with illustrious and dynamic women. What we know for sure is that the narrative of the African woman as an entrepreneur has changed. You started off with the illiterate businesswoman who was trading. All of us here represent entrepreneurs. And all around us, we see women doing new and innovative things within their businesses. So it is important for us to recognize that the narrative has changed and it must change. the long-standing cultural, social, institutional barriers that have kept women away from certain ecosystems, certain sectors, or has devalued the contribution of women must be eradicated. Along this line, you mentioned earlier that this month is Women's Month, but we've also celebrated or acknowledged, marked, whichever term people used to use, International Women's Day. And in actuality, we're talking about 113 years of women striving for equality, striving for inclusivity. And with that in mind, we have to remember always that the SDGs are here to support us in creating this value system for women to be included in that trade, in that ecosystem. And they're very specific SDGs that we must ensure that are incorporated into the fiber of trade and into the fiber of business. You know, SDG 4, quality education, it's important. SDG 5, equality, it's essential. Reducing inequalities, that is integral to what we do in the area of trade. And of course, decent work for women, you know, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in their businesses. I find it very necessary for us to create what I consider gender responsible and responsive inclusivity, recognizing that women are the backbone of trade in Africa. You know, 70% of women are entrepreneurs, 45% of them are in the micro. But within that MSMEs, it's a very informal sector. So how do we begin to continue to build capacity and skills so that these women are included and there's added value for what they bring to the ecosystem? There has to be equal access to opportunities. When we put out tenders, when we're working with financing, we have to break down the barriers that restrict women from not being able to access what they need. In the informal sector, they don't traditionally have all of the collateral that you're looking for. So what else can be put in place to support them? When you put out tenders, maybe we can actually state that this is open to women-led businesses. That way, women know that they can use these opportunities to scale their businesses and that they're not removed from that larger ecosystem that we all recognize. Creating business networks, you know, it is traditionally there were business networks for women, and within that they could develop. But the reality is for women to scale to the level where they can trade intercontinentally, there are many other levels that must come into place. There must be mentorship, there must be sponsorship. And I'm not talking about financial sponsorship, I'm talking about other leaders taking them under the wings and showing them how it is to scale and to be recognized. Technology has been mentioned. It is very critical. It is beyond having a smartphone. It is recognizing that digital trade is here to stay, and these avenues must be made available to all. Improving logistics, the biggest hurdle on the continent, apart from energy, is logistics. How do I trade if I don't have transport? How do I trade if I don't know how to then go beyond that? And we must also address the issues of, you know, unconscious bias that exist in trade and in the workplace. We have to think about the online biases that women will face, as well as the physical harassment that exists. But I do think that it's important for us to recognize that trade does not have a gender. Trade is open to all, and all should be able to access it. So inclusivity is very important, and male allyship is integral. So let's get the males to support the women in the businesses, in the trades, and the things that they're doing, so that we can have a more resilient and inclusive economic system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ama. Let's bring in the males. Let's get them to assist the women. And it's also very interesting that you spoke again about capacity building. We can't, you know, overemphasize the need for that, so women can scale up from the small scale informal trade to more formal and larger scale trade. So I would like to bring Faith back right back in here, because we are aware that the International Trade Center is doing a lot. They're actively engaged in capacity building exercises for the efficient execution of this protocol through the She Trade Initiative. How effective, Faith, would you say that this has been so far?
Thank you for that question. Indeed, our work has had an impact through mainly the approach that we use. We mainly do through projects, through the She Trades Hubs, and through partnerships. So since 2015, our She Trades projects have been the primary means of delivering technical assistance and supporting women entrepreneurs. And we also work with hubs, which are national host institutions to establish, which are decentralized platforms in order to deliver in-country interventions. And also we have partnerships, which we work with the private sector in order to drive positive change for women entrepreneurs. So under projects, I would just like to zoom in on one of our projects that we implemented. It's called the She Trades West Africa project, where we worked with women in agricultural value chains in farming households that grow cash crops such as cashew, shea, and cassava, and other associated crops. So this project started in 2019, and we launched it until 2023 last year. So with this, we managed to target SMEs that have been able to improve their competitiveness and market linkages. And also we've helped them to generate sales worth 3.6 million. And we have received business leads and worth an additional 2.4 million. So this is just one of the projects that shows the impact that one of the projects has had. We've also have the continental network of women's business associations we managed to launch. So this continental network is meant to bring all women's business associations under one umbrella and for them to directly engage with the AfCFTA Secretariat on how they can better present their opportunities. So this initiative has been launched and it has been created, and as a result, they will start implementing activities under the AfCFTA once it has been registered. We also develop policy briefs. We on the policy side, we work with policymakers, because we know that in order to implement effective change, it is just not the capacity building side of things, but also the policy side of things. So we also work with policymakers to ensure that inclusive policy reforms are introduced in each country, so that it speaks to the needs of women and also what we're trying to target. So overall, in a nutshell, what we can say, the capacity building has been very effective, as we have directly supported a network of over 100,000 women-led businesses. And also we have been offering technical expertise in facilitating trade, improving competitiveness of women, and also integrating businesses, the business sector in developing countries. And also we have a global network of 250 partner organizations from 65 countries where we work directly with them. So all of this is just a brief nutshell of some of the impact that we have. Of course, we have different projects across, and I would need more time to delve into each and every project and the different impacts that it has had. But I've just highlighted some of the main that where we have seen a massive impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anis, and very, very excited that you mentioned share. You know, I've always been fascinated with share and the potential that it has. Almost everywhere you turn in the Western world, in Africa, share is used for one thing or another. And wouldn't it be just wonderful if women were able to harness the potentials that are in that business to take their place in this multi-billion-dollar business. They share for all sorts of skin products and beauty products and so on and so forth. And there's just so much abundance of it growing all over the continent. It'd be really, really good for women in the agribusiness area to explore and exploit this fantastic crop. Thank you for reminding us of the existence of that crop when you mentioned it in your intervention just now. And so we come to Isabel. We haven't heard from Isabel this morning. Isabel Akwa is the director for the Center of Law and Innovation at the CERTA Foundation in Rwanda. And Isabel, my question to you this morning is, in your experience, what are the typical challenges faced while working with different women across the African continent? How have you been able to overcome these challenges, and what scalable policy approach would you like to see as a solution to address these issues under this AfCFTA protocol?
Hi, good morning and good afternoon. And also thank you to the host for this session and to the panelists as well. Very amazing insights. I think we've touched on some of the typical issues. I think Julia mentioned some of these in her opening remarks, but access to finance is a big issue. And by access to finance, it's access to financial education, access to funding. We find that female founders are still notably underserved when it comes to setting up, entrepreneurial ventures, access to funding. If you look at, for example, smallhold farmers that are primarily or predominantly women, climate access or climate funding, less than 1% goes to the smallholder farmers and thereby women. So access to finance obviously is one key issue. I think another thing we see is confidence that has been shaped by cultural and traditional narratives. And so that really blocks women from actually even making decisions to own business, own land, own assets. In as much as we've made tremendous strides, you still see a lot of limitations that women place on themselves because of these narratives that we are sort of subjected to. Another thing that is, a big issue is the burden for women on the continent. I mean, this is globally, but particularly in the cultural context of Africa, women are still the primary caregivers, whether it's for children, but also later for aging parents. And that work is never really valued or validated. And so how do we make sure that women are actually able to value that work? How are they paid for that work? How is that work recognized by the workplace? So again, you don't see a lot of policies around that area. Having a seat at the table, of course, I think a lot of people have touched on that. In as much as we've got Agenda 2063 talking about ensuring, 50-50 parity in decision-making positions. In Rwanda, the constitution actually by law states that women have to have 30% of decision-making roles, leadership roles. You still don't see that on the ground. So in as much as we have, these big ambitions, you don't necessarily see women taking their place at the table. And then the fifth thing really for me is, and a few people have touched on this, is gender-based violence. It's something we don't talk about, but it's a reality. 1 in 3 women still a survivor in our context. And I see it from two perspectives. There's one, the cost of gender-based violence. So this is the cost of counseling, of hospitals, of, what it costs us to actually deal with survivors of gender-based violence. But the other thing that we don't really talk about a lot is the lost time, the lost economic productive output because of gender-based violence, which is also a cost. And so I think those are the things that really hinder women, hinder really the real full participation of women. In terms of the protocol itself, I think the protocol is a great framework. It's fantastic. It's a real catalyst for change. And I think we should applaud the AU for coming up to this point. I think where I am a little concerned is this is a framework law. very lofty ideas. Fantastic, but what happens next? How is this actually going to be implemented in our laws, and how is it going to be enforced? I think on the continent, we write some of the best laws. Our problem is not the laws, our problem is enforcement. And so that's really where I think we're really going to see what happens next, right? This is an amazing step. I think it's very worthy of praise. But what actually happens? How is this actually going to be implemented, and how is it going to be enforced?
Thank you very much for that. And I guess that's why we're here,
Yeah.
to make sure that we keep talking about these things and keep them on the table, And so I'll just hand over to Nana now.
Thank you, Isabel, for that, and mentioning the issue of enforcement and implementation. Julia had mentioned that as well early in the discussion. We have all these protocols, the initiatives, the laws, and things like that, but often we still have this big gap between what actually should be and what there is, and it's all about implementation. So I'm hoping that as we go on in our discussions, it would also come out how we can take quicker steps at implementation and enforcement so that we see these things becoming a reality. Before I ask the next question, I'd just like to remind our participants that you can ask questions. You can type your questions into the chat box. And when we get to the Q&A, we'll read the questions out to our speakers so that they can address your questions as well. So my next question I would like to bring to Dr. Amma. Dr. Amma, I'd like to talk about value creation, very topical. It requires tangible results on the African continent. What practical ways can women engage in trade that allows value to be created through wholesome consideration of economic impact on goods or services for the exchange of money?
So the question is twofold for me when people talk about value creation. On one hand, I think about what the individual is contributing to the ecosystem, as well as how the ecosystem recognizes the contribution of that individual. So we have to recognize the role of women in the economic growth of a country, and we have to recognize their role in trade. It is well known historically that women have been traders. And as we mentioned earlier, collectively, that role has changed in terms of the avenues and the ecosystems that they plug into. And we recognize that the informal sector is heavily informal. 94% is the number that I have heard espoused on many occasions. Going back to some of the things that my colleagues have mentioned, it is important for us to increase and improve women's participation in leadership, because when you have women at the table, when you have women as decision makers, they're able to ensure that the policies that are coming through are beneficial to all, not just to men, but to women as well. We also have to recognize that there is an environment that must be enabling for trade to occur, whether it's within the country, within the environment that the person is producing, or intercontinentally or internationally. Inclusive language, I have found that language that is used in business, language that's used in trade is not always inclusive. We're having a lot of male pronouns, and we're having a lot of images that are encouraging men to participate, but not the same. So advertising also must be inclusive so that women can see themselves, and the language must be inclusive for women. It's important that programs that have been discussed today are highlighted and made accessible to women as well. And we also have to recognize, as mentioned by one of the ladies recently, I can't remember which of them, forgive me, that women come into the work, trade, economic sphere for different reasons, but for that same reason, they sometimes have to step away because there's a natural process that they go through of birthing a child. And so making sure that they can come in and out seamlessly without the biases that come through when it comes to promotion or accessibility. Oh no, she's pregnant, she might not be available for another 6 months. Well, she might be pregnant, but she is available because pregnancy has never stopped anyone from being able to contribute to an ecosystem, and it does not stop entrepreneurs from working. I also think it's important to recognize the purchasing power of women, because that is the added value that they bring to the ecosystem. Women not only can loan and encumber loans, but they can repay it. And that goes back into scaling their businesses. And that allows people to continue to loan to them. So looking at how we can change the parameters that help them to add value to the products that they're providing is very critical. And I do think that we should continue to gather more data. Data is very critical. We don't have enough data. And with more data, we can begin to see where the gaps are so that we can fill those gaps for women. And we should also encourage women-owned businesses and women-led businesses to participate on a global scale, starting within their national regions, but also intercontinentally. Truly, certification is important because we want the products to meet international standards, but also having those avenues is also critical. And finally, I would like to add that there's so many sectors that women have not broken through. And it's the cultural and institutional biases that prevent them. So that high time that we break those down so that they can fully be able to give valuable goods and services and make those available on a larger scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ama. And it's interesting that you mentioned women do not put themselves forward even when the opportunity presents itself. And I think it was Isabel who had made that point earlier. So thanks for bringing out those ways in which women can be encouraged. I would think mentorship as well would help a great deal to get women to put themselves forward, put them out there for these roles. I'd like to come back to Isabel and ask you what supplementary approach you would adopt towards fulfillment of the protocol in terms of technology sensitization for women and youth.
Thank you so much, Nana. I think, for us, let me just explain it through one of the projects that we worked on, which was empowering or is empowering women in border communities in Rwanda. And the idea was to look at informal business owners, female business owners, and to do 4 things. The first was to help to formalize their businesses. The second was to help digitize their business. Third was to expand. So expanding into new markets, expanding under AfCFTA. And the fourth was to ensure that they were fully empowered. So again, looking at not just the business side, but ensuring that they had SRHR training and really empowered. Because when you empower a woman in a rural community and she suddenly becomes a, not head of house, but able to contribute, the changes of family dynamics. And so it's also important for us to look at that. But on the technology question, it really is important that we bring technology to women at every level. I think a lot of the times we focus on STEM education, which is excellent. And we definitely need more of that because we're still not seeing as many women, or young women, I should say, take up STEM positions. Here, it's very important that there's a lot of representation. I think that is key. So you've got to keep showing women in positions of leadership in those roles and not just traditional women roles. So the STEM education is important, but it's also important that we actually take technology out into sort of these rural areas. And so our digitizing part of the project is to ensure that they have digital literacy. And it can be as simple as, how do I use Instagram to open up a new market? How do I get tools to actually put my client information or my business information in a much more structured digital way, so I have a better access to it. And so we're very focused on how we empower women through digital technology. I think digitization is really the great equalizer, and it really is the opportunity for us not to just leapfrog as a continent using emerging technology, but also for women to really close that gap in terms of, what we were talking about before, not having many women funded businesses, et cetera, et cetera. Once you have digital products, it really is a great equalizer. And so we're very intentional about making sure that we look at it at all levels, not just the STEM education, but also going into the rural areas and making sure that we are not just empowering women to say, here is some business literacy, but also ensuring that they have digital literacy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So again, capacity building to empower women. We have to keep talking about that and ensuring that it actually happens. I'd like to come to you on the question of financing. Julia, you have many years of corporate finance experience. I'd like to ask you, in your practice, what sort of financial measures or instruments can be leveraged for the benefit of women who require funding for their businesses?
Sure. Well, even for very small businesses, but also for some quite ambitious business plans, I see a lot of people, both men and women, who start off with funding from friends and family. And I do think that that should not be discounted or ignored. And if that's done with reasonably good agreements, as opposed to too casually, then that can be a great basis actually for funding. And I've actually seen at least 2 family and friends started businesses which ended up as stock exchange listed companies. And I was involved from the beginning to the end. So that's definitely possible. This may sound rather esoteric and ambitious, but, crypto funding, tokenization is something to look at, because that is a very new market. And if women and young people understand how to digitalize, that is a huge source of funding, potentially. I mean, agricultural cooperatives, for example, could tokenize the proceeds of production and so on. And I was actually at a crypto summit this morning in Hong Kong, and I was listening to a talk from a CMO of what he claimed was one of the world's largest crypto exchanges, and it's based in South Africa. And South Africa is set to license more than 60 crypto platforms by the end of this month. It's kind of leading the world in terms of that kind of licensing. So, I mean, that is a very genuine opportunity in Africa. Obviously, it's only available to those who have a certain level of education and access to technology, but I don't think it should be ignored. There's in Hong Kong, where I work, there's government funding. There's several funding schemes specifically designed to fund women, and there are support from those kind of government schemes. And I think during COVID in many African jurisdictions as well, there was support from government funding. So some of that involves education to see how to obtain and access that funding. There also may be government-backed loans and credit facilities, and some Commonwealth countries have established loan programs and credit facilities. For example, there's bank loans and financing with particular programs dedicated to women entrepreneur loans and so on, which HSBC, for example, provides. Venture capital and angel investing, that's one step up from friends and family. If you get a business going, you may be able to get some outside investors. And there's certainly some African investment platforms who are doing that, who I've talked to quite a lot. There's a lot of funding coming through a platform in Mauritius. I realize it's a drop in the ocean compared with the funding needs of the whole of Africa, but that kind of funding is available. I think for women, they should really make sure they continue, and as we've heard repeatedly, to focus on women's networks and mentorship, because that can often lead to opportunities to find funding. There's crowdfunding platforms. Some of them are online. Some of them exist within Africa, certainly within Hong Kong and other parts of the world. Microfinance and peer-to-peer lending. Microfinance, of course, has been around for quite a while, and it's very suitable for smaller businesses, for women with small trading businesses. But peer-to-peer lending platforms are certainly available in Africa to some extent. But again, that requires access to a good range of technology, and it may be somewhat complicated for women in smaller businesses. But for somewhat growing and larger businesses, that may be a very good alternative to traditional banking services. I think that small businesses everywhere suffer from lack of access to bank finance. And that's not just an African problem. It's actually a problem of funding SMEs everywhere. But there's an example, I think, of something called a Lift Above Poverty organization in Nigeria, which certainly plays a role in providing small loans and financial services to women entrepreneurs. And then finally, where the sky's not the limit, there's listing on stock exchanges and there's M&A exits for very successful companies. And, that has happened in the case of some of my female clients, as well as grants and subsidies and some gender lens investing perhaps. But, that's a very limited category of investing, but it's certainly worth looking out for that and something which women's networks could perhaps focus on. So that's a sort of bird's eye view of what might be available. But of course, it's a huge amount of education, which should really start from teenage girls at school through to courses in colleges, access to online courses, events such as these, just to get the idea and to constantly be getting the message out that there is access to funding and that accounting courses, short business executive courses, and so on may give women a sense of confidence about how to approach this kind of borrowing, which is intimidating. It's intimidating for everybody and often quite intimidating even for educated people. It really depends on their business sense. So Absolutely. That's a few thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julia. That's really insightful, and again, we're back to the mantra, awareness, and not just awareness, education as well. Like you rightly pointed out, it's not just people who are not so educated, even those who are would find it daunting to navigate some of these things. So that's the mandate, I think, that's the charge, to make all these things aware to the people who need them, and also the opportunities to get sufficient information and training in how to not just access them, but to use them to their greatest benefit. Thank you for that insight. I think we'll continue to interrogate all these questions and continue to tease them out, and try and ensure that we don't take them off the table so that people can access them. We've been talking a lot about women, and now let's do some talking about youth as well. So Janice, I have a question for you. Youth engagement and integration within the East African community is quite prominent through organizations like YouLead. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to tell us a little bit more about YouLead. Now, in what way would you advise that youth become incentivized to sufficiently partake in trade under the protocol? I think this is a good place to take off from where Julia just left off. So over to you, Janice.
Thank you very much, moderator. YouLead is a flagship program that has been established to sort of like bring the youth together within the EAC region to sort of like enable them to bring out their issues that are sort of like hindering them to like participate in trading and other related things, sort of like hindering them to advocate for what the hindrances they have in place that sort of like stops them from accessing different opportunities that are available for them being in doing business or technologic-wise and so forth. So as a private sector business support organization, EWIP, we think youth as part of the private sector should be active whistleblowers on regional and continental trade instruments that are not working. There are a lot of things that are not working for women. So having such platforms as YouLead sort of like brings the youth together to bring out their thoughts that will be tabled and like give out recommendations that will be addressed to the EAC, to the Council of Ministers, and of course to different governments within the EAC region. We think that youth should become agents of reform when it comes to trade policies that are not working, and other trade policies. What trade policies are working, and how do the government sort of like facilitate those trade policies that are working so that they can sort of like support the youth participation in regional integration. Of course, the youth are facing a number of challenges. For instance, the lack of capital that has been addressed earlier. We have the issue of access to finance. Most of the financial instruments, when you, for instance, you go to the bank, they will want you to have a collateral. But for instance, I'm a fresh graduate from school. Where do you expect me to get a collateral from? We have an issue of lack of support to nurture youth businesses. The issue of mentorship comes here. Who does the mentorship of these youth? Where do we get the mentors? These are the people that have already been successful, or they've already walked in the journey whereby these youth are trying to like pave their way through. How do we connect these people with the youth that are sort of like trying to penetrate the markets or that these people have already penetrated? Also, there is an issue of lack of support to startups. What policies do we have at government level, at EAC level, that favor or support the startups? Do we have like a special fund set to support the startups? Do you have like mentorship opportunities? Do we have hubs that are supporting these youth? We have the issue of curricula. In our universities, in our colleges, how do we train our youth to become entrepreneurs? And how do we build on different talents that they have? I usually challenge some of our MPs here, like our curricula, the time when we were in school, it's like you have to become an engineer, you have to become a scientist. No one taught us how to become entrepreneurs. How do we sort of like change the narrative? How do we like make sure our curricula sort of like bring awareness on their existing opportunities or being entrepreneurs out here? We have the Women in Youth Protocol that has been formed by the AfCFTA Secretariat. I would really like to applaud that, but then it's in paper, as it has been mentioned. How do we make it actual? How do we make it work within the youth? A lot of sensitization, of course, has been brought forward by our previous speakers, and a lot of sensitization needs to be done. We need to change the narrative of including the youth, make whatever we're doing youth inclusive. We need to change our curriculums and ensure that they include, they start grooming the youth from a very young age. So when they're out of college, they're out here trying to do other things, not necessarily being employed, they are able to do so. And of course, I would like to stress on the issue of mentorship. It's very critical. You cannot say the youth are there without having mentors to take them through different processes that they are supposed to go through for them to be successful in whatever they're trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Isabel, you have an intervention? You'd like to add something to that?
I was going to say, I mean, just following on from Janice's points, I think, especially with regards to startups and youth, and a lot of our youth are startups, because when you look at what our job market can absorb, we cannot absorb the number of graduates we actually produce each year. And I was just saying, I 100% agree with Janice that nobody actually teaches you to be an entrepreneur. And that has to be something that we start looking at more intently. We don't wait for people to be in university. We've got to start teaching entrepreneurship when they're 10 and 12. And that's what actually happens in the US. Kids are a lot more entrepreneurial because they're giving both the hard and the soft infrastructure, right? They have the hard infrastructure, they have the data, they have the systems that work. You can rock up to a cafe, you have data at home, but they also have the soft infrastructure, which is the mindset that says you can create, you can thrive, you can build, and you can break things and fix them. And we don't have that in our culture. One of the things that we do within Center for Law and Innovation, we have a startup incubator. And the reason we set that up was we realized that startups were giving more and more, and even then we don't have enough, but they were given more and more space. So they have, they can go to a startup hub where they're given a space to work, because that was our first issue. We don't have spaces. You can't necessarily say a startup can just build at home because they don't necessarily have the data bandwidth. So you have those incubators. Those incubators don't only just provide a space, they provide the data that you need, the actual, infrastructure, and they also provide an ecosystem. But what we found is that a lot of startups were not sustainable. They were not being provided with the corporate governance or the legal or the regulatory support, because lawyers are waiting for them to build up to the point you can actually pay for those services. But what happens is if we don't build sustainable startups, we're not actually doing anything. You just have creative ideas that are just mulling around and they don't actually build. If you don't have strong startups, they don't create jobs. They don't, and decent jobs like SDG 8, they're not doing anything. And so what our incubator does is it actually takes startups in and we provide full legal support for them. Because you'd be surprised, again, back to the education point, just because I'm a graduate of a university and I've got this brilliant tech idea, it doesn't mean that I understand the value of my intellectual property. I've registered my company, and we've had this a number of times. You'll say, do you have the IP registered? And they say, yes. Where is the IP certificate? Oh, I registered my company. Here's my company certificate. Because you're not educated to understand that that's a completely separate registration. And so we're seeing a lot of that we need to unlock the value of our young people, and we need to support them beyond telling them, go and be a lawyer or a doctor. How do we build entrepreneurs that are actually strong and can build sustainable businesses and can then expand and digitize and trade across borders? And we need to make sure that we're building that capacity for them. So just wanted to just add that intervention.
Thank you. Nana, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Isabel. I mean, it's very important. I often say most young people would have, just started their businesses, they shy away from going to law firms because of the fees. They think, no, this is going to be too much. I can handle it myself until I get to a certain stage. So, but by the time they approach us, they've gotten themselves into a situation which really is unnecessary, which could have been avoided. So that's something to ask lawyers and law firms as well. The more we need to open up, and do these things. It doesn't matter. It's something to give back to help these startups to also be able to, stand on their feet and be able to make it. Thanks for that. So I would like to bring in Faith at this point. Faith, as we've mentioned, the legal issue, I want to talk a bit about standardization. The issues with the unification of women's policies around the world, and they require standardization. In your experience, would you say the challenges faced in terms of capacity building for export vary significantly around the world?
Thank you for your question. Indeed, we do work with policymakers and trying to standardize the different and working with the different regions across the world. We have tools that we use in terms of helping on the policy side. We have what we call the She Trades Outlook tool, which is a tool which helps to improve the policy ecosystem for women in trade. And also it helps to unlock markets for women by identifying and eliminating obstacles in the policy ecosystem. And in terms of the challenges that like women face in terms of standards, it's pretty much the same. So with this tool, it's a tool that when we launch the She Trades Outlook tool in a country and we look at the different gaps, the idea is to implement policies that are gender responsive and that speak to the needs of women. So we do have a roadmap. We do have the foundation or the blueprint of what policies should be introduced. So when it comes to different areas of exporting. So with this tool, it helps us to standardize the different interventions, the different policy interventions that we're doing, that we're working with with other women. We also so it maps the environment for women in trade, and then we examine the data gaps, and then we identify the potential areas for inclusive policy reform. So that's also a first step. So a specific example would be like the global gender responsive global public procurement campaign that we're trying to launch in terms of ensuring that women access public procurement. Across the globe, we have about 40% of women who participate. We have 40% of public procurement tenders that are issued, especially in developing countries. But only 1% of this goes to women or any women-led or women-owned business. So with this tool, these are some of the areas where this global campaign is also just an example of the unification of women's policies, specifically in public procurement, that the ITC is launching. And also for capacity building with the She Trades Outlook tool that I have mentioned, it's this tool that we've been using across the different countries to make different interventions. But most of the challenges that women face, you do find commonalities there, and then of course in each country, then there will be other small specific differences that then we'll have to tailor. But at a general or at a continental level, the challenges that women face, especially when it comes to exporting, it's the same. But with this tool, the She Trades Outlook tool, we've been able to make interventions. And as a result of this tool, then we also develop policy briefs. So these policy briefs, they would target like different areas in different areas of trade. So we have SPS, we have TBT, and it's focused on women. Another specific example would be our one of the projects that we've just been implementing with the FAO for women in value chains in the poultry and the soybean value chains. And we were looking at the specific challenges that the women in these sectors face. And we looked at specific case studies, and Nigeria was one of the countries that we looked as a specific case study, also for fisheries. And we looked at Senegal, we looked at Tanzania, and but the goal was to look at the challenges specifically for women who wanted to export in these value chains, and how we could intervene and introduce different changes. So through the She Trades Outlook tool and the different policy briefs that we developed for the different specific areas, we've managed to kind of like identify and narrow down the different challenges that women face, and also provide recommendations at a policy level. So we provide recommendations at the continental level, and we also provide recommendations at the in-country level, where if, for example, for the AfCFTA, we do conduct policy dialogues at the continental level, at the regional level, and then at the national level. And once we do that, we provide a set of policy recommendations that are designed to be inclusive for women, and then roll it out from their own ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faith. I'm going to take you up later on these policy dialogues and how can they actually drill down into actual actions, as opposed to just designing policies that never actually get to the people for whom they're meant. But I mean, thank you for the insights. Only 1% available to women. And so we know that these biases exist. And yet women have been proved to be better managers of resources, good managers of businesses, given the right opportunities and exposure to the right tools. They could actually fly, particularly in the area of designing their businesses for export. So we know that these biases exist, not just against women, but against youth as well in trade. And yet our youth are doing such amazing things. They're willing to take risks, and they're capturing the future in leaps and bounds in ways that are at such dizzying speeds, and we know that they face biases and challenges. So, Julia, my next question is to you. We know that these biases exist, right? What steps do you think we can take to mitigate some of these biases against women or youth involved in trade?
Sure. Well, it's quite staggering, isn't it, that I think around 70% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa are under the age of 30, and over 60% of people in Africa are under the age of 25. So clearly harnessing the enormous potential of this fantastically large youth population, which I think by about 2030 will be 42% of the world's youth population, is absolutely crucial for the future of Africa. So it's very important. And listening to everybody, I agree with so much of what I've heard, and it really seems that execution is strategy. Unless this can actually be implemented, a lot of the things which we're talking about, the amazing achievements of the Africa continental free trade area and so on, and all the agreements and protocols that go with it, actually execution is crucial. So where do we start? Well, conducting awareness campaigns, education programs, challenging stereotypes against biases against women. And these should probably target not only the general public, but I think politicians, key stakeholders, policymakers, business leaders, financial institutions. I don't think it's about women and youth being given opportunity. I think they need to take it in many ways. And I think that really is, really the message that they really, there's enormous power in such numbers. And I think they really deserve the opportunities which, the communities in Africa can give to them and which do exist. And I do think it's terribly important to communicate with youth, that it's a very different way of communicating than it would be, say, to my generation. It needs to be done digitally. It needs to be done on whatever is the latest platforms they are using. It needs to be done in ways which probably may seem like fairly short bursts of this shorter digital attention spans and so on. So we really need to think carefully how to communicate with younger and younger generations, all of whom, well, not all of whom, because they won't all have access to digitalization, and I'll come on to that. But for those that do, that is really going to be the key to speak their language. And I think, the Commonwealth can perhaps play a bit of a role in this, that there can be more promotion of the trade rules and the opportunities within the Commonwealth. For example, there's business school research which says there's a 20% cost advantage in trading among Commonwealth countries, which some people think is why Togo, Gabon, and Rwanda have joined the Commonwealth relatively recently, because of some of the trade advantages that may go with that. But then I think we've talked already about access to the internet, which is clearly going to be a very huge driver of trade. And internet access in sub-Saharan Africa is 25% overall, although it's, there's some places which are much, much better. The world average is about 51%. I think mentorship is very important, but perhaps for young people, we're talking more about influencers who are talking about opportunities in business and so on, not simply mentorship, and perhaps online mentorship, online influencers who have a very positive message about what's possible and educating about business and opportunities are going to be very important in creating. We need not just successful entrepreneurs, we need experienced professionals who are going to support businesses. And that whole ecosystem needs to grow up together. And platforms, digital platforms, which can share best practices. And as we heard, there's this gap in startups being able to get legal advice. And that's absolutely right, because they usually can't pay. So sort of sets of documents, sets of protocols which they can use, which I know some organizations in Africa are working on, really deserve to be hugely promoted. And I think entrepreneurs, networks, and so on can be great sources of those. We've heard about addressing biases in access to finance and business support. And I do wonder whether we should look at quotas in terms of outcome, because when you hear of percentages like 1%, you do wonder, don't you, about really there was no good enough applications. It rather reminds me in Hong Kong, where there's the most highly educated female population, many of whom are managers, leaders. Actually, the percentage of women on listed company boards is 13%, and people still have conversations about whether there's enough board-ready women. Well, really? I don't think so. France could find them pretty quickly when it actually mandated that as a matter of law. So I do think some of this, sorry to go back to what I was saying earlier about quotas, both probably in the allocation of finance as well as senior positions. And I think we need to make sure that all these lending practices, financial institutions, government agencies should make sure on an equality basis that they're absolutely free from gender and age-related biases. And again, that could be looked at in terms of quotas, certainly published quotas to begin with, if not actually mandated quotas. I think there could be better training programs. We've heard about incubator support. That's wonderful for women and young people to overcome barriers and develop their entrepreneurial skills. And we also heard about how people have to learn to fail. I mean, we all have to accept that I think about 10%, if we're lucky, of startups will actually succeed. And an even smaller percentage of that will go on to be large, successful businesses. And that really needs to be inbuilt into the culture. And that brings me on to legal and regulatory reforms. So, as well as reviewing and updating laws about discriminatory practices and equal opportunities, we also need to look at inheritance laws, property rights, labor and employment relations, and so on. But we also need to look at bankruptcy laws, so that the US is probably a very good example in this regard, that you can actually, businesses can fail and you can move on to the next business. Now, of course, that needs to be balanced with fraud on the public, but nevertheless, in order to create an entrepreneurial culture, you have to have those legal frameworks. And I think you're going to need collaboration between legal professionals, policymakers, advocacy groups, and so on to drive these reforms. And so increasing representation and role models, I think, for you in youth, the youth area and in the women's area is very important to inspire others. I remember when I was a junior lawyer in my law firm in London, because I'm so old, there wasn't a single woman partner. And I couldn't imagine myself in a leadership and a partnership role until I watched an American TV series, a soap opera called LA Law, where there was a senior woman managing partner. And I thought, oh, I can do that. Now, obviously, women have more role models nowadays than they did in my day. But nevertheless, I do think that's incredibly important to have role models, both amongst the youth who've done well and are upstanding people, and also women who advocate for other women and who actually are good role models. And I think in the modern world, it's very much simpler to collect data. So the data analytics, the research on analyzing the data, on participation and challenges, and not simply brushing them off and brushing women off to say, oh, well, you wouldn't want to do this, or you're not up to it, or something like that. There's so much data available to inform evidence-based policies and initiatives. And there could be collaborations with research institutes, trade associations, universities and so on, to make sure that these biases against women and youth are really identified in the workplace, in trade, in business, to take a multifaceted approach using that data to engage all the various stakeholders to move forward to create a much more inclusive approach to developing trade and economies generally.
Thank you so much, Julia. I mean, you're right. Africa is blessed with such a youthful population. And I really like the point about breaking these biases against women and youth through education, communication, mentoring the youth, using influencers and all that, so that we're leaving these things behind as we move along. I'd like to bring you in, Dr. Amma, if you don't mind. But before I do that, I'd just like to say to participants, thank you for sticking with us. We see that participants are engaging with us. We have some questions. In a few minutes, we'll be coming to that. We'll be bringing you in so your questions can be put to our speakers. Dr. Amma, talking about youth again, what sort of security measures do you think that youth require in order to confidently engage in business and trade as a going concern under the AfCFTA?
Before you answer that, let me just jump in very quickly. I just want to remind all our listeners that there's another poll on, and please fill it out. Sorry to interrupt you. Please carry on.
Oh, not a problem. Well, thank you, Nana, for that question. And I'm going to piggyback on Julia's response, where she talked about the vast population of Africa, which is going to expand to 2.5 billion by 2050. And the average age will be 18 on the continent. And it's become imperative that we recognize that the way out of the unemployment and the underemployment and the poverty is probably looking to entrepreneurship. And given that as an avenue, of course, job creation will occur because not everyone can be an entrepreneur. But given that premise, closing the gap in education is very critical. At this point in time, less than 8% of women are in university, tertiary education, only 8% of women, for lots of reasons that we've already discussed, from the cultural to the institutional, name it, it prevents women from going on. But we need to change the way that we educate on the continent and change the mindset for what it is we think women should be doing, because we have to start at a very young age to value the girls the same way that we value the boys. We also need to change the type of education that we're providing, because many come out and can't see an avenue with the degrees that they have. So they go on to something else as a way of having a living, of trading, of being entrepreneurs. So that change in mindset to what youth can do or girls can do, and as opposed to what they should be doing, is very critical. And even within education, the curricula needs to be updated. You have a lot of people who their attention span is much shorter. You have a lot of people that are learning on the virtual plane. So AI, machine learning, all of that needs to be in place from the primary school level going up. We need to begin at a very young age to have internships, work studies, apprenticeships. These are all viable means of gaining the skills that allow them to access trade, that allow them to participate in trade, in business. So that has to be recognized. It's very important for us to build channels of communication and trust with the youth. Very often they feel left out. One of the things we do at Africa Sustainable Trade is always bring the youth to the table, because their perspective differs from ours. You know, you talked about your age, Julia. I won't mention mine. But the point is, we need the youth to show us, to demonstrate what it is that is needed for them to be part of the ecosystem. Yeah. We need them to representation of the youth at the table. When we look around us, creative industry is important to them. Sustainable textiles is important to them. The circular economy, innovation, They grew up with these things, yet they don't have access to it. And they don't have access to the technology on a larger scale. I mean, when you have 25% access to the internet, how do you grow to be able to be on a global platform? Because ultimately, we want commerce to occur not just within your home sector, but intercontinentally and, of course, for export. So we have to rethink how we are interacting and bringing youth to the table. And we need to help them to understand business from a very young age. There's some universities now where they're looking at the actual end result, so they're going to be entrepreneurs, and let's give them courses that are going to guide them towards that. And at a very young age, we're teaching digital education, we're teaching money studies, financial studies. All of those things can only help to enhance how youth come into the entrepreneurial space. And the most important thing for them is always funding. How do I get the funding? How do I access that? And we've got to think of other avenues to make that impossible for them to grow. So mentorship is important, but sponsorship is important. And when we think of sponsors, like Julian mentioned, the influencers, they call them, or those who are teaching them those trades, and those who are interacting with them should help them, guide them, and show them the other avenues. I do want to end on this note: creativity. Without creativity, there is no innovation. And if we don't begin to enhance creativity in schools, we're going to lose this population as well. We know from studies that creativity diminishes once you start formal education. So let's think of other ways to enhance creativity. We don't have to regurgitate the same answers. We don't have to put the same drawings. Let's encourage creativity so we can drive innovation. And that in itself will increase the variety and the diversity of products and systems that are available to youth and to others, so that there's a healthier, more sustainable and resilient economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Ama. And thank you to everyone for all your interventions. We now move very quickly to Q&A. And we already have 2 questions. I'll ask them both. And they're to no one in particular. So feel free to answer them as you wish. The first one is this: digital trade across Africa will be instrumental for the AfCFTA. How do we train and educate the youth regarding protection of their intellectual property, data protection, consumer protection, etc.? That's the first one. And the second one is that the protocol on women and youth in trade has recently been adopted, as we know. This is why we're here. In comparison to the other protocols, do you think this protocol should have been negotiated earlier, given the fact that SMEs are mostly comprised of women and youth, who ultimately will drive the success of the AfCFTA in general? So who would like to take a stab at either or both of those questions?
Well, I would like to take a stab at both questions. I'm going to start with the latter because I've always believed that and it goes back to what Julie and I were stating earlier, when you have representation of youth and women at the table, then it is easier for you to incorporate them at the very start of your discussions rather than go back to include them. Inclusivity is the theme of this discussion, and inclusivity should be the theme at any point in time where policy is being created. It's almost like an afterthought, and yet it should be at the forefront, given the data that we have in terms of who is driving the trade and what sectors are more represented by women and youth. The second thing goes back to education. We talk so much about formal education, but we have to incorporate informal education. And informal education are the things that you see on the internet, those little 2-minute blurbs, 3-minute blurbs. It's a way for all of us to begin to educate the youth on their intellectual property. They don't know it. They think that once they've registered a business, everything is set. But if we can actively begin to give that information to them, in small bites at a young age and have more business discussions, trade discussions, economic discussions, they would learn very early, even before they begin to set up their businesses, that this is part of it. I mean, you have lemonade stands in some places. Well, what that design is unique to you, so that's your intellectual property. It's just very simple things that we can start with to educate the youth and to make it more inclusive for women as well. And we must not forget to educate the illiterate women. I'm coming back because you started that discussion with me with illiterate women. We cannot forget that we must educate illiterate women. We must have information available for them in their languages. It is possible. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. May. It certainly is possible. I mean, some of the things that these so-called illiterate women know, you know, they know much more than we do. That they can't read and write in a formal sense. You know, they've got it all up here. You know, they're really amazing. And certainly that illiteracy doesn't always seem to be a handicap. We have 2 comments. I'll just read them out, even though we can see them. Catherine Kariuki says, true, Dr. Ama, education policies influence a lot in terms of empowerment and skill sets. So we're in agreement there. And Isibo Oekinan says, well said, inclusivity should be factored in. There should be awareness and parity. I think if we don't take anything away from this session, we certainly must take away the fact that we need to put our thinking caps on how we can get this awareness of all these, not just policies, opportunities and information, how we can get it across to the end users in a way that is meaningful to them, that they can actually benefit from, and so that it's not just developing policies here and there that never really get executed. You know, as Julia said, execution is strategy, execution is critical, and this really must be the charge. I don't know if we have any other questions. Okay, I have 2 questions here. One says, how can we sensitize women and youth? For example, how can we engage a woman in JOS regarding the benefits of the AfCFTA? I think this is what I was just saying. You know, we need to make these things practical to ordinary people who can benefit from them. They need to understand that this is not just some highfalutin thing. This is something that affects them at their own levels, and we really must put our thinking caps on and figure out how to get this information in bite-sized chunks to the people who need them, the women and the youth who need them. And then we have a question from, let me just bring that back. There's another poll that came on that has just, okay. So we have a question from Nankunda Katangaza, she says, could we have some specific comments or thoughts on women or youth-led businesses in the services sectors? Often trade in Africa is directed at trading goods, but yet services drive the exchange of ideas, know-how, technology, and are what is digitally traded. They also facilitate trading goods, so they have potential significant gains for African businesses and economies. Who would like to answer that? Could we have some specific comments? Anyone? Specific comments or thoughts on women or youth-led businesses in the services sectors?
May I take a stab at this very quickly?
Yes, please.
Services. It is the one sector that I think is underscored on the continent. When you think about how India, for example, has developed services and they're able to sell their services, there is no reason why we don't have youth being trained in that sector. It's a sector that can be incredibly beneficial economically, and yet it doesn't have the attention it's needed. And I think part of it has to do with the energy issue and the technology limitations on the continent. And so it becomes imperative that we look at those areas, because if we can access those tools that are necessary, skills that are necessary, they're actually here already, then we can enhance the availability of and the generation of revenue from these sectors. So we almost have to start new industries where services becomes available, and we can then export those services as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
In here, please. Yeah, I totally agree. And I don't think Africa does too badly on services. I think there's more than 50% of African generally is services-based economies. And I think South Africa in particular does a fantastic job. You know, there's a lot of amazing education platforms which are available internationally for all sorts of education out of South Africa and all of that. So, you know, whilst there's this enormous pool of talent and reserves of people and young people who could undoubtedly just, the sky's the limit of what could be produced, I do think there is a good basis on which to grow the services sectors in Africa. So I don't think we should be too pessimistic. It's really looking at how to engage and actually, perhaps it's a sort of thing which governments could actually support in terms of infrastructure, that it could actually raise the services sectors quite enormously, because as it was mentioned, things like electricity, access to internet and so on are major things. And I do think a lot of these services can be delivered digitally internationally.
Thank you, Julia. I'm going to hand over to Nana now to take you all through your final thoughts. And in your final thoughts, I'd like to remind us of the question that someone just asked there. How do we sensitize women and youth? For example, how can we engage a woman in Jos? Jos is, for those who don't know, a city in Nigeria, up in the northern part of Nigeria. I guess that's a metaphor for how do we sensitize a woman who is not like in a capital city, for instance, or an urban center, strictly so called, regarding the benefits of AfCFTA. I think we're all saying the same thing. How do we bring this home to people who need them? So Nana, over to you for final thoughts. And please, there's a message in the chat saying, please respond to the final evaluation poll if you have not done so already. Thank you very much. Nana, over to you.
Thank you, Yinkan. So, ladies, before Yinkan does the closing, I'd like to take final thoughts from everyone. I noticed that Janice and Faith had their hands up earlier, so maybe you might want to incorporate this into your final thoughts. So briefly, everybody, I think we just have about 3 minutes to take all final thoughts. I'll start with Janice.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to give my comment on the trade-in services, based on the experience we have here within the EAC region. I know the EAC Common Market Protocol under Article 1.1, Article 11 calls for enhancing labor mobility within the community through harmonization and mutual recognition of academic and professional qualifications. This has been quite a process, and at EAC we have managed, the current status, we have managed to successfully negotiate and sign a form mutual recognition agreements on professional domains of accountancy, engineering, architecture, and veterinary science. But then you can see that this is like, it was quite a process, because we want to see, we have like accountants from Tanzania that are able to work in Rwanda, for instance. We want to see engineers from Rwanda, they are able to come and get their practicing certificates in Tanzania. So I think the harmonization of these professional certifications has been gradually taking place, but it's quite a process. And that's why we see it's like underutilized. So I would like to encourage the key stakeholders, the partner states, to sort of like take a keen interest in this for us to be able to facilitate the trade in services. And also I would like to insist on the issue of capacity building and awareness creation to the women and youth on the AfCFTA. We have done a lot of awareness creation within the EAC region, but when these awareness creations, you ask people, do you know what Africa Continental Free Trade Area is? people are wondering like, okay, what are you talking about? Very few people are aware. I know we have started trading under the Guided Trade Initiative, the GTI, but then how many people are able or are aware that there is such kind of initiative that will help us to sort of like learn on how we are going to trade within the AfCFTA? I think that will be my views for the time being. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janice. Again, education, capacity building, awareness creation. Faith, briefly, final thoughts.
For me, maybe I'll just touch on the Youth and Trade program at ITC, and also to touch on the question that was mentioned on intellectual property. We have partnering with WIPO as an initiative to conduct awareness training for intellectual property, especially targeting the youth and women. And also for services, we are also engaged in different activities, also raising awareness, focusing on the importance of services and the services sector in the different countries, and also working mainly with women and youth, and the different contributions that they can make in the services sector. So we are doing this we're working with women entrepreneurs and young entrepreneurs, and also we're working with policymakers at the same time to identify the different challenges that the women and the youth face in services, and how they can best utilize the trade in services protocol, and also benefit from the protocol and the different opportunities that are created there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Julia, brief final thoughts from you.
Thank you. Well, I was asked to consider the lives of women and young people in Jos, and I just looked up Jos, which is apparently a mining community. That resonates with me because I grew up in the northeast of England, also mining communities. And I think people need to see change in their own lives. They need to see it in their day-to-day lives. So here's an example from my life. I remember being thrown, once I'd moved to London, I was actually thrown out of the staff canteen at a city law firm for breastfeeding because it offended somebody, because I had my baby brought to me. So, there's a lot of things that need to change about women in the workplace and women in trade. And it really resonated with me when I heard that women at border crossings weren't able to breastfeed. I mean, that's something which affects both professional women and, people, ordinary workers. So I think that type of facility for women and making it easier and more acceptable for women to fulfill all their other obligations and functions while working or in business or in trade. Whether they're working, they may be supporting a business that's trading, but all of that type of equality and acceptance of being able to balance this in their lives and making it easier for them, that would be a real change. Access to internet would be a real change. Education, as we just heard about the AfCFTA and all the opportunities that may go with that, and access from wherever they are, whether it's Jos or anywhere else in Nigeria or Africa, to the online training opportunities, mentorship and so on, which should be part of the execution strategy, one would hope, of this fantastic AfCFTA and the 8th protocol. I would hope that would help to drive things forward, to actually embed this in people's lives so that they wake up one morning and think, well, I know what that is, and yeah, it has made a bit of a difference.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Amma, we can hear from you finally.
Yes, in terms of the question that was posed as to how do we get this information or make it more accessible, I think it goes back to the question of language that I spoke to earlier, that it is possible for us to get this information across to people in language that is digestible for them. I mean, some of this stuff is very voluminous, but if you can put it in simple structural context where they can understand it pictorially or in discussion, it will be very beneficial. It is also possible for us to look at the type of pictorials that are used to represent it, because much of it has males, females. Let's include the youth, let's include women. When you can see yourself, then you can know that it's relevant to you and you're more likely to pick it up. And of course, where possible, if you can translate it into the local languages, there are NGOs that are happy to provide funding for this to occur. And we should take advantage of that. You know, I am strongly of the opinion that diversity is very critical to growing the economy. And diversity in terms of services and goods is the way that we can create a sustainable and resilient economy that is inclusive of all women, youth, and of course, I have to say, men. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Alba. Now, Isabel, last but certainly not the least, your final thoughts.
Thank you so much, Nana. I would say three things. One, implementation is going to be critical. And while we wait for our governments to figure it out, we should all be doing what we can in our individual capacities. And so if you're a law firm, take a couple of startups, put them under your wing, make sure that they get the support they need. Secondly, we need infrastructure. We can't go around that issue. If we don't have the digital infrastructure in place, it doesn't matter how ambitious we are, it's not going to happen. And so beyond capacity building, which for me is soft infrastructure and mindset change, we need to make sure that we actually are pushing our governments to put the infrastructure in place. And that means roads and cheaper flights. So you can fly, you know, from Lagos to Kigali without looking like the same price as flying to, you know, the Middle East. So we've got to get those sort of things in place so that we actually are facilitating trade. And the third thing I would say is we've got to change our perspective on risk in two ways. One, when we look at women, there's a TED Talk I was listening to a couple of weeks ago, and she said, we teach our men to be brave, or our boys to be brave, and we teach our girls to be perfect. And so we don't allow women to grow up with a sense of risk taking, and that's really important. I think it was Julia who said that the opportunities are there, we have to take it. I think we need to make sure that we're teaching women to be risk takers. We've got to deal with all of the, you know, the other issues we've talked about, SGBV, violence, and lack of access to all of those things, but we also have to teach our women to take risk. And when it comes to the youth, we have to take risk on youth. We've got to get them to the table. We have to ask them to join us before they are perfect. And I think a lot of times we're waiting for youth to get experience, but where are they going to get the experience from if we don't take a risk on them? And so I think our perspective of risk has to be changed and challenged when it comes to women and youth so that we can actually see the economic and social dividends that we expect.
Thank you so much, ladies. Very strong final points coming out there. It's been very exciting. Oyinkan, I don't know what you think, but there've been some strong themes really coming out, and I hope that our participants have enjoyed it, and that implementation has really come out strongly. We need to make sure that these policies are not just out there, but that we make sure that we are implementing them. Oyinkan,
thank you very much, Nana. And this is a perfect timing actually, and very, very key when women are concerned. We keep to time. And yes, this is a good time for those of us who are at lunchtime to break for lunch. I'd like to thank our fantastic faculty, all of you with your intimidating credentials and intimidating insights, very, very insightful contributions. Everybody is much better informed, including myself, after this session. I'd like to thank also all the people who attended, and not just attended, engaged. I'm looking at the various comments in the chat group, and I can see that people are really, really engaged with this. And it's very, very heartwarming to see. So let's keep the fire burning. Let's just, the risk of sounding cliche, let's keep the flag flying, and let's continue to work to make the AfCFTA work. And the only way it will work is if the information and the awareness becomes widespread, digs in deep. I guess by this Women and Youth in Trade protocol, the AfCFTA will begin to see quantum leaps, because once women engage with something, then the sky is really the limit. So we thank you all. I'd also like to say, at ALP, we've been converts for a long time, and our aim with our town halls is to win as many souls as possible, to sign people up to the AfCFTA to understand what it's all about, to engage with it for African continental trade. We have a resource, a fantastic resource where more information can be obtained, alptrade.africa. That's alptrade.africa. We have 3 wonderful people who are collectively a treasure trove of information about the AfCFTA, trade in Africa. We have Henry Honoria from ALP Uganda. We have Patricia Michiso from ALP Kenya, and we have Adekola Thompson from ALP Lagos, Nigeria. Please visit the website, find out the information. We thank you all. To all the people who made comments, who have asked questions that we weren't able to take. Unfortunately, we want to keep to time. We want people to know that when we do these town halls, we stick to it. It's a strict time limit, and so we won't be able to take them now. But we've noted them all. And those that require responses, we'll certainly get in touch with you. We have your details on tap now, and we will continue to engage with you all. On that note, I'd like to thank everyone and wish you a very pleasant rest of the day, and see you at the next town hall. Thank you very much.